First of all, I'm very happy to be here in Bern. It's my first visit to Bern. I would like to thank the General Prize Committee and, of course, the Balzan Foundation for giving me this award on the theme Atoms and Ultra-Precise Measurement of Time. I'm very honored and deeply grateful about receiving this award. So in this presentation, I will give you a glimpse of what time measurement is, and give you, explain to you how an atomic clock works. And I hope I will start from the basic things. And then I will show you how we use cold atoms, as Professor Ngosho recalled in 1 minute, simply because of the fact that if atoms are cold, they are slow. And if they are slow, you can observe them for a long time. If you can observe them for a long time, you can make high precision measurements on them, in particular precision measurement of time intervals. So let me start with a provocative question. Does time exist? And as you know, after Minkowski, Poincaré, Lorentz, and others, Einstein answer made here in Bern, upstream here, said no, there is no universal time. Newton in classical mechanics had introduced a time that would be everywhere the same, uniform, flowing uniformly, and being the same for everyone in the universe. But Einstein said no. There is not a single time. There are as many times as observers. And then you would say, what's going on there? Yes. And so this is that time and space make a single block that are described by the equation of general relativity. And so time is deformed by matter, and the space-time is continuously deformed by matter, and so it is the general relativity equation that he made a bit later, 1915, that describe actually the evolution of time in the universe. Then you would say that clocks are useless, and why do we care about making many clocks, like these people here? But of course the answer is no, because time is what a clock measures. And so every observer can have his own clock and realize what we call the proper time in his reference frame. And Einstein showed how you can synchronize clock at a distance in various gravitational potential in various systems. And so it is not that time doesn't exist, it is that we have to use it in respecting general relativity laws. So after this, paradox introduction, I would like to go back to the operation of clocks. And as Professor Ngosho said before, for a clock, you would like to find a simple phenomenon, which is regular, and we call it periodic, that repeats itself as much as possible unperturbed. And so people initially looked at nature, observing the Earth's rotation, the day and night, and you have all these beautiful, like the one on the top left, you have these beautiful sundials, which are everywhere on the official facades, and probably many of them here in Bern. And you have also the motion of the moon, calendars. You have also the hourglass on top right here, which the idea was to make it simpler because the motion of the sun is slow, and so if you want to measure something on the 1 minute scale, then the hourglass is better than the looking at the needle, on the wall of a building. And so this is really where the human realization comes in, and I think we should say that it was Galileo Galilei who invented the first modern clock concept by the pendulum, which is a simple phenomenon described by a very small number of parameters. Here I give you a formula. The period of the pendulum depends on the length of the pendulum and the gravity acceleration, local gravity acceleration. That's it. And so at the bottom, I show oscillations, and introducing one of the very important concepts, which is that if the pendulum runs faster, you will measure time interval more precisely. So take a delta t time interval, as shown on this graph. If you have only 5 oscillations to measure this interval, maybe it will be 5, 5.5 or 5.2, or so you will have an uncertainty on the time interval measurements. But now if you have 1 million oscillations, like on the right, which is not 1 million times faster, but then you will describe very well if I have 1 million or 1,000,001 oscillation to measure this time interval. So it's a fundamental concept behind measuring time, which is to find a natural periodic phenomenon that oscillates as fast as possible. And so today the best clocks are atomic clocks. The oscillator is no longer a mechanical oscillator like in your watch or in the pendulum, but it's an electromagnetic field. As you know, light is made of electric and magnetic field, which oscillate with the frequency, and this is again Einstein's contribution, and so which oscillates much faster than the pendulum. In a quartz oscillator, you have 10 million oscillations per second. In a cesium clock, you have 10 billion oscillations per second. And so this is why cesium was chosen as a definition of the International System of Units. The second is based on the cesium atom for that reason, yes. And so the oscillator is an electric or magnetic field. And quantum mechanics, as recalled by Professor Engelshaw, described atoms very well. The microscopic world is described by quantum mechanics, and the excitation by light by Einstein in particular. And the crucial point is that unlike a pendulum, atoms are all the same. An atom in Bern, in Tokyo, in Paris, in New York, they are all identical. They have the same properties. And so this is the key idea for developing atomic clocks, and that I will explain on the next slide. And as I said before, if the atoms are very cold, we can observe them for a long time. Let me just recall here one important obvious application, which is of atomic clocks, is that the positioning system like GPS or Galileo for the European version, you have your cell phone, and on your cell phone to come here, many of you have taken your cell phone and your positioning system. And you should know that in the satellites, which are shown here, you have atomic clocks on board, and you need very good atomic clocks to make your positioning correct at the few meter level. So it's a fantastic application because it's used now everywhere, at the individual level. And no one could imagine when inventing atomic clock 70 years ago that such kind of application would take place. And so now let me enter into the principle of an atomic clock so that you learn something today. It's a composite system. On one hand, you have the atoms, and on the other hand, you have an oscillator. And this oscillator can be a quartz oscillator, like in your watch, or a laser beam, in which the oscillator frequency is much higher. So in the green color, you have a 510 to the 12 oscillation per second, so extremely fast oscillation. And so, as was shown by Planck and Einstein, if you shine this oscillator frequency onto an atom, when you hit a resonance in the atom, which is a resonance in which you can promote the atom from the ground state to the excited state, so you create a resonance in the atom, and so you have, when you record the spectrum, when you scan the frequency of the oscillator, you have a bell-shaped curve, which shows that the number of excited atoms increases. It's small on the edge of the resonance, and it's high at the top of the resonance. And so what you do in an atomic clock is that you will try to transfer the precision of the top of this bell-shaped curve onto your oscillator. Your oscillator will have drifts, thermal drift, or depend on pressure, on humidity, and so forth. But the atom does not. The atom is really, the energy level separation are governed by quantum mechanics, and this energy can be calculated very well and modeled very well. And so you will make a servo loop, you will force the oscillator here at the bottom, You interrogate the atom, and you make a correction if the oscillator drifts, so that the oscillator remains exactly at the tip of this resonance. And there you understand that if the resonance is sharper, then the clock will be better. The sharper the mountain, the better you will determine the top of the frequency. The top determine the frequency of the oscillator. And this was what was done already 70 years ago, exactly 70 years ago, by Essen and Parry in UK at the National Physical Laboratory. On the left, you have a machine, which is an atomic beam, in which you have cesium produced here, and you have a first interaction region. The atomic beam flows from the left to the right, and the atom will be excited here and here, and then you detect. And you see, this kind of line shape, centered at 9 billion oscillation, 9.192 oscillation here, and you have a resonance, and you will lock the oscillator on top of this resonance. I explain the shape of this resonance in the next minute. And already in that paper, they point out that the stability inferred by the signal-to-noise ratio and the line width of the resonance here, which is about half a kilohertz, so 500 oscillations per second in the time domain, this was already better than the Earth ephemeris, or the ephemeris time that was defined at the time in 1955 as this fraction of the tropical year 1900, which is not a very useful definition because you cannot go back to this period. And so they already point out that atomic clock would be a much better realization of time measurement. And indeed, today, we have clock stability which are 10 orders of magnitude better than at that time. So the gain was 10 orders of magnitude in 70 years, which is an exponential gain, and we wonder whether this will last. This is an open question for discussion. So how did we gain these 10 orders of magnitude over the last year? And the first crucial ingredient was laser cooling of atoms, which is shown on this graph. And Professor Ingosho mentioned the Nobel Prize here. And so this is in a vacuum chamber. You apply 3 pairs of laser beam that go in 3 directions here. And at the intersection, you collect atoms. This is a real picture of what is called optical molasses, in which sodium atoms emit this yellow light. And you have about 10 million atoms which scatter light, and they are permanently cooled by these laser beams at a temperature, in this case, of about 100 microkelvin above the absolute zero. But in our group in Paris, we worked with cesium, as was mentioned by Professor Ingosho. And to measure the temperature, we just let them fall down. So here is the molasses, and then they drop. And when they cross this laser beam, which is 7 centimeters below the molasses region, you see the atom fall down, and you have a peak here. And the width of this peak simply reflects the spread that the atom have done during the free fall. And so the narrower the peak, the lower its temperature. And we were surprised to find a temperature as low as 2 microkelvin. So what does it mean, 2 microkelvin or 1 microkelvin, just to make a number simple? It means that the atom spread is only 8 millimeters per second. So it's about a factor 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4 less than in the temperature in this room. So hence, this very low temperature. And so the atom falls. So to make a clock, we devised a system which was even proposed earlier by Zacharias at MIT to make a fountain clock as shown on this graph. You cool the atoms here by this laser beam. You launch them up through the cavity which excites the atoms. The atoms are excited on the way up. They make a round trip in the Earth's gravity field. They spend the time t above this microwave excitation zone. They fall down, and they fall down in the probe beam that I was showing on the previous slide. And when they cross the probe beam, they emit fluorescence, and this fluorescence is collected on a photodiode. And this is how we detect the signal. So here I would like to mention one of my long-term colleagues, André Clairon, with whom I've experienced all this a series of experiments who passed away in 2010, and this has been a wonderful experience to work together for all these clock projects, and I would like really to give a tribute to him here. So coming back to the resonance, this is a signal that you obtain, actually, when you do this double excitation. You can excite the atoms on the way up or on the way down, and so you scan the oscillator here, and one point is a 1 second measurement. So it's really a real measurement here. It's not a simulation, and you see that we have about a signal-to-noise ratio of 5,000 per point, and the key point is that the interaction time on this graph is half a second. So the line width is 1/2t is 1 Hertz. This is 500 times narrower than in thermal beam atomic clock. And so this is where part of the gain is obtained by the laser cooling. And so once you have a good clock, you have to have a second one. A clock per itself, you cannot, you have to compare it to some other clock. And this is what we have done some years ago, in which you measure the clock stability as a function of time. Here you have 100 seconds, 1 day, 10 days here, and you see that the precision of the time interval measurement, the precision of the frequency determination improves by the square root of the measuring time. So this is a really fundamental law here. And you get 1 part in 10 to the 16 for the clock stability at about 10 days of measurement time. And this is where you should be careful about Einstein's effect, the Einstein gravitational shift. If the clock is on this table or on the ground, you will measure a shift that you can measure with 10 to minus 16 clock. And so this is where people have built several of these devices. You have about 20 fountains in operation, and they all are compared through a GPS satellite comparison system by the GPS constellation that I've shown before. And this is how the International Atomic Time, TAI, Temps Atomique International en français, is computed by the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures, BIPM, with an accuracy of 1 or 2 10 to minus 16, which means that the error per day is in the range of 10 picoseconds. So a picosecond is a millionth of a millionth of a second, fraction of a second. So 10 picoseconds is a very, very small error per day. And so this is now how these cold atoms have entered into the high precision measurement regime. And so now I would like to show you that with this clock, in a fountain, if you want to make the resonance sharper, you have to launch 4 times higher. If you have a 1 meter fountain, you go to 4 meter fountain, you gain only by a factor 2. And so it's very tempting to do it in space, actually. And this is why in 1997 I proposed to the European Space Agency and the French Space Agency the mission called Atomic Clock Ensemble in Space, in which we would put this device, the fountain device, but miniaturized, and I show you the picture in 1 second, onto the International Space Station, which orbits the Earth at a height of 400 kilometers. You can see it at twilight very well. It's a big satellite, actually. And profit from that situation, that you will realize a very good cold atom cesium clock in microgravity, because on board the space station, as you've seen, astronauts fly, and they have no gravity, they experience no gravity, far reduced gravity, I should say. And then we can make fundamental physics tests, because of the Einstein effect will be different on board the International Space Station and the ground clocks here. And worldwide access, essentially, you will be able to compare clocks on different continents with a very good precision. So this is an ongoing program. And so I was at the launch at Kennedy Space Center on April 21 with a bit of emotion, you know, because when you spend 30 years of your life working on the space project, you hope that it will not make a flame. But indeed, thanks to SpaceX company and to NASA, who provided this launch, everything was fine. The clock system that we launched was this one, you know, with the cold atom clock. I have no time to enter into the detail. it makes a lot of noise and vibrations when you launch this device, so this is why you're a bit nervous. And this is the Dragon module open, and then this is our platform, which was by the robotic arm, the Canadian robotic arm, transferred to this place of the European module, Columbus, and facing the Earth so that we can exchange electromagnetic signals in the microwave domain to compare the onboard clock here with the ground-based clocks. And so this is a picture of the device that we have built. And going from the laboratory to a compact system that can experience launch vibration, thermal change, and so forth was a big challenge that was made by European industry. And so we are quite happy about the operation of this clock. So here the principle is the same as the 1955 clock. You have, instead of using a fast atomic beam, you use a laser-cooled source. Here, you cool the atoms, you launch them very slowly into the device where they make interaction 1, interaction 2, and then you detect them here. Very simple. And you see these kind of signals. You recognize the same type of signals as before. And the line width here is similar to what we have on Earth. But on the next slide, you can see that we can have these atoms flying for 10 seconds in the device, crossing the Ramsey cavity for 1.5 seconds and maintaining coherence for 1.5 seconds, which is shown here. So the resonance line here is even short, 0.3 hertz, is narrower than in the fountains on the ground by a factor 3 already. So with this clock, we will test the Einstein effect. I have no time to enter into this formula, but essentially the clocks live in a deformed a potential, which is shown by this, this surface here of equipotential. So time runs differently on the ISS than on the ground, and the difference is very large. It's 33 microseconds per day. So it's not large by human standard, but as a measurement, the GPS, your GPS system, if it were not corrected for relativistic effect, would not work at all, actually. And so this is what we are going to do. We are going to test the Einstein formula at 2 parts per million with these clocks at a stability and accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 16. But this is not the end, because in the recent years, the community has developed even better clocks. A clock which operates in the visible part of the spectrum, like this laser pointer. And here you see the evolution of the accuracy of the clock as a function of time. The fountains that I've explained to you started to operate in 1990, like this here, have reached 10 to the 16, but it reaches a plateau because of many technical aspects, and the simple fact that the oscillator doesn't run fast enough. But in the optical domain, optical standards, you have this gain in accuracy, and now we are reaching 10 to minus 18 accuracy and 10 to minus 19 stability. So the 9 order of magnitude that I was describing before. So those are incredible devices. They are still laboratory type devices. They are not ready to go to space, but this will come in the future. And this uses neutral atoms like strontium, ytterbium, mercury, cadmium, either trapped in an egg box like this, or in a lattice like this, or trapped ions, which are also excellent optical clock, and those are developed in many laboratories around the world. And so, remember, 10 to minus 18 now is 1 centimeter of gravitational shift Einstein effect. So this has important application in geodesy. And so to finish, I would like just to show you that with the help of the Balzan Prize, actually, for the young investigator, we are going to hire young postdocs simply to help us in making the data analysis of this ACES mission. And ACES will connect, actually, 8 ground terminals of that sort, antennas related to excellent clocks in many different parts of the world, in Japan, here near Tokyo, in the US, NIST and JPL. In Europe, we have 4 ground terminals like this. In the UK, in Paris, in PTB, in Wetzel, and we have also one transportable terminal that will move to Switzerland here and to Inrim in Italy for making clock comparison campaign. So ESUS will make a network, essentially, of the best clock that exists on the world, and they will compare them to a stability of 10 to minus 17, perhaps 10 to minus 18, once we control fully the microwave link time transfer system. And so with this, I would like to stop and thank again the Balzan Prize and thank all my co-workers, on this project, which are shown here, and the Balzan Foundation, of course, and in particular Luigi Cacciapuoti, who is the ESA project scientist for this mission. So I thank you for your attention.